Hello, and welcome back to the Reformed Rogue reading of Civilization on Trial by Arnold Toynbee. We are picking up where we last left off at Chapter 3. Does history repeat itself? Does history repeat itself? In our Western world in the 18th and 19th centuries, this question used to be debated as an academic exercise. The spell of well-being which our civilization was enjoying at that time had dazzled our grandfathers into the quaint pharisaical notion that they were not as other men are. They had come to believe that our Western society was exempt from the possibility of falling into those mistakes and mishaps that have been the ruin of certain other civilizations whose history, from beginning to end, is an open book. To us in our generation, the old question has rather suddenly taken on a new and very practical significance. We have awakened to the truth, how, one wonders, could we ever have been blind to it, that Western man and his works are no more invulnerable than the now extinct civilizations of the Aztecs and the Incas, the Sumerians and the Hittites. So today, with some anxiety, we are searching the scriptures of the past to find out whether they contain a lesson that we can decipher. Does history give us any information about our own prospects? And if it does, what is the burden of it? Does it spell out for us an inexorable doom, which we can merely await with folded hands, resigning ourselves as best we may to a fate that we cannot avert or even modify by our own efforts? Or does it inform us, not of certainties, but of probabilities or bare possibilities in our own future? The practical difference is vast, for on this second alternative, so far from being stunned into passivity, we should be roused to action. On the second alternative, the lesson of history would not be like an astrologer's horoscope. It would be like a navigator's chart, which affords the seafarer, who has the intelligence to use it, a much greater hope of avoiding shipwreck than when he was sailing blind, because it gives him the means, if he has the skill and courage to use them, of steering a course between charted rocks and reefs. It will be seen that our question needs defining before we plunge into an attempt to answer it. When we ask ourselves, does history repeat itself? Do we mean no more than, does history turn out to have repeated itself on occasions in the past? Or are we asking whether history is governed by inviolable laws which have not only taken effect in every past case to which they have applied, but are also bound to take effect in every similar situation that may arise in the future? On the second interpretation, the word does would mean must. On the other interpretation, it would mean may. On this issue, the writer of the present article may as well put his cards on the table at once. He is not a determinist in his reading of the riddle of human life. He believes that where there is life, there is hope, and that, with God's help, man is master of his own destiny, at least to some extent in some respects. But as soon as we have taken our stand on this issue between freedom and necessity, that is raised by the ambiguous word does, we find ourselves called upon to define what we mean by the word history. If we have to limit the field of history to events that are wholly within the control of human wills, then, to be sure, for a non-determinist, no difficulty would arise. But do such events ever actually occur in real life? In our personal experience, when we are making a decision, do we not always find ourselves only partly free and partly bound by past events and present facts in our own life and our social and physical environment? Is not history itself, in the last analysis, a vision of the whole universe on the move in the four-dimensional framework of space-time? And in this all-embracing panorama, are there not many events that the most staunch believer in the freedom of the human will would admit, as readily as the most thoroughgoing determinist, to be inexorably recurrent and precisely predictable? Some of this Some events of this undisputedly recurrent predictable order may have little apparent bearing upon human affairs, as for example the repetitions of history in the nebulae outside the system of the Milky Way. There are, however, some very obvious cyclic movements in physical nature that do affect human affairs in the most intimate fashion, as, for example, the recurrent predictable alternations of day and night and of the seasons of the year. The day and night cycle governs all human work. It dictates the schedules of the transportation systems of our cities, sets the times of their rush hours, and weighs on the minds of the commuters to whom it shuttles to and fro, twice in every 24 hours, between dormitory and workshop. The cycle of the seasons governs human life itself by governing our food supply. It is true that man, by taking thought, can win a measure of freedom from these physical cycles that is beyond the reach of the birds and beasts, though the individual cannot break the tyranny of the day and night cycle by leading a waking life for 24 hours in the day, like the legendary Egyptian pharaoh Mykerinus. Human society can achieve Mykerinus' mythical feat collectively by a planned cooperation and a division of labor. Industrial plants can be operated for 24 hours in the day by successive shifts of workers, and the labors of workers who work by day can be prepared for and be followed up by the labors of other workers who rest by day and work by night. The tyranny of the seasons, again, has been broken by a Western society that has expanded from the northern temperature zone in the tropics into the tropics and the southern temperate zones, and has devised a technique of refrigeration. Nevertheless, these triumphs of man's mind and will over the tyranny of the two physical cycles of the day and the year are comparatively small gains for human freedom, remarkable though these triumphs are. On the whole, these recurrent, predictable events in physical nature remain masters of human life, even at the present level of Western man's technology, and they show their mastery by subduing human affairs, as far as their empire over them extends to their own recurrent, predictable pattern. But are there perhaps other human acts in other fields of action that are not, or at any rate, not so completely under physical nature's control? Let us examine this question in a familiar concrete case. When, in the last days of April 1865, the horses that, in the first days of that month, had been the cavalry and artillery horses of the Army of Northern Virginia, were being driven behind the plow by the men who, at the beginning of that April, had been General Lee's cavalrymen and artillerymen. Those men and horses were once again performing an annually recurrent agricultural operation which they themselves had performed a number of times before in their lives, and which predecessors of theirs in the Old World before Europeans discovered the New World, and in other societies before our Western society's birth, had been performing year by year for some 5 or 6,000 years past. The invention of ploughing is coeval with the species of society that we call civilizations, and pre-plough methods of agriculture, likewise governed by the yearly cycle, were already in use for perhaps an equal length of time before that, during the Neolithic dawn by which the sunrise of civilization was heralded. In the spring of 1865, agriculture in the ex-Confederate States of North America was governed by the seasons very rigidly. A few weeks' delay, and the seasons would have been too late, with the disastrous consequence that the food-producing capacities of those horses and men would have been lost to the community for a whole year longer. Thus, in the last days of April 1865, the horses and men of the former Army of Northern Virginia were performing a historical act, the spring plowing, which had repeated itself by that date some 5,000 or 6,000 times at least, and was still repeating itself in 1947. In that year, the writer of this article witnessed the spring plowing in Kentucky, and noted the farmers' anxiety when, in the middle of that April, their work was interrupted by heavy rainfall. But what about the history that General Lee's horses and men were making, not at the end of April, but at the beginning? Is the kind of history that is represented by the last act of the Civil War a kind that repeats itself, as plowing and commuting repeat themselves owing to their close and obvious dependence on recurrent predictable cycles in physical nature? Are we not confronted here with a kind of human action that is more or less independent of physical cycles and is capable of overriding them? Suppose that General Lee had not found himself constrained to capitulate till June 1865. Or suppose that, General Lee having capitulated when he did, General Grant had not been moved to make his celebrated concession of allowing the Confederate soldiers who had just laid down their arms to take their horses back with them to their farms, notwithstanding the contrary provision in the terms of surrender that had just been agreed upon. Would not either of these hypothetical man-made variations on the actual course of historical events have prevented history from repeating itself in the southern states in the spring plowing of 1865? The province of history that we are considering now is one that used to be treated as the whole field of history, before the provinces of economic and social history were opened up. In this old-fashioned field of battles and policies, captains and kings, does history turn out to have repeated itself as it does in fields of human activity that are manifestly governed by cycles in the movement of physical nature? Was the Civil War, for instance, a unique event? Or do we find other historical events that display sufficient similarity and affinity to it to warrant us in treating it and them as so many representatives of a class and of events in which history has repeated itself, at least to some extent? The present writer inclines to this latter view. The crisis represented in American history by the Civil War was surely repeated in a significant sense in the contemporary crisis in German history that is represented by the Bismarckian Wars of 1864 to 71. In both cases, an imperfect political union had threatened to dissolve altogether. In both cases, the issue between the dissolution of the Union and its effective establishment was decided by war. In both cases, the partisans of effective union won. And in both, one of the cases of their victory was their technological and industrial superiority over their opponents. In both, finally, the victory of the cause of union was followed by a great industrial expansion, which turned both the post-bellum United States and the Second German Reich into formidable industrial competitors of Great Britain. And here we have hit upon another repetition of history. For throughout the century ending about 1870, the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain might have appeared to be a unique historical event, whereas, since 1870, it has come to appear in its true light as simply the earliest instance of an economic transformation which was eventually to occur likewise in a number of other Western countries, and in some non-Western countries too. Moreover, if we shift our attention from the economic common feature of industrialization to the political common feature of federal union, we shall see the history of the United States and Germany at this point repeating itself once again in the history of a third country, in this case not Great Britain, but Canada, whose constituent provinces entered into their present federation in 1867, 2 years after the de facto re-establishment of the unity of the United States in 1865, and 4 years before the foundation of the Second German Reich in 1871. In the formation, in the modern Western world, of a number of federal unions and in the industrialization of these and other countries, we see history repeating itself in the sense of producing a number of more or less contemporary examples of the same human achievement. The contemporaneity of the different instances is, however, no more than approximate. The Industrial Revolution occurred as an apparently unique event in Great Britain, at least 2 generations before its occurrence in America, and Germany proved it to be a repetitive phenomenon. The insecurely welded pre-Civil War United States had existed for 47 years, and the ramshackle post-Napoleonic German Confederation for half a century, before the crucial events of the 1860s proved that federal union was a repetitive pattern which was to recur not only in Canada, but in Australia, South Africa, and Brazil. Contemporaneity is not an essential condition for the repetition of history on the political and cultural plane of human affairs. The historical events that repeat themselves may be strictly contemporary, or they may overlap in time, or they may be entirely non-contemporaneous with one another. The picture remains the same when we turn to the consideration of the greatest human institutions and experiences that are known to us. The civilizations in their births and growths, their breakdowns, declines, and falls, the higher religions in their foundation and evolution, measured by our subjective personal measuring rod of the average span of the memory of a single human being who lives to a normal old age, the time interval that divides our present generation from the date of the emergence of the Sumerian civilization in the 4th millennium BC, or from the date of the beginning of the Christian era, itself seems, no doubt, a very long one. Yet it is infinitesimally small on the objective timescale that has recently been given to us by the discoveries of our geologists and astronomers. Our modern Western physical science tells us that the human race has been in existence on this planet for at least 600,000 and perhaps a million years. Life for at least 500 million and perhaps 800 million years, and that the planet itself for possibly 2,000 million years. On this timescale, the last 5,000 or 6,000 years that have seen the births of civilizations and the last 3,000 or 4,000 years that have seen the births of higher religions are periods of such infinitesimal brevity that it would be impossible to show them, drawn to scale, on any chart of the whole history of this planet up to date. On this true timescale, these events of ancient history are virtually contemporary with our own lifetime, however remote they may appear to be when viewed through the magnifying lens of the individual human midget's subjective mental vision. The conclusion seems to be that human history does turn out, on occasions, to have repeated itself up to date in a significant sense, even in spheres of human activity, in which the human will is at its nearest to being master of the situation, and is least under the domination of cycles and physical nature. Must we go on to conclude that, after all, the determinists are right, and what looks like free will is an illusion? In the present writer's opinion, the correct conclusion is just the opposite. As he sees it, this tendency towards repetition, which thus asserts itself in human affairs, is an instance of one of the well-known devices of the creative faculty. The works of creation are apt to occur in bunches, a bunch of representatives of a species, a bunch of species of a genus, and the value of such repetitions is, after all, not difficult to discern. Creation could hardly make any headway at all if each new form of creature were not represented by numerous eggs distributed among numerous baskets. How else could a creator, human or divine, provide himself with sufficient materials for bold and fruitful experiment, and with effective means of retrieving inevitable failures. If human history repeats itself, it does so in accordance with the general rhythm of the universe. But the significance of this pattern of repetition lies in the scope that it gives for the work of creation to go forward. In this light, the repetitive element in history reveals itself as an instrument for freedom of creative action, and not as an indication that God and man are the slaves of fate. What is the bearing of these conclusions about history in general on the particular question of the prospects of our Western civilization? As we observed at the beginning of this paper, the Western world has become rather suddenly very anxious about its own future, and our anxiety is a natural reaction to the formidableness of the situation in which we now find ourselves. Our present situation is formidable indeed. A survey of the historical landscape in the light of our existing knowledge shows that, up to date, history has repeated itself about 20 times in producing human societies of the species to which our Western society belongs, and it also shows, with the possible exception of our own, all these representatives of the species of society called civilizations are already dead or moribund. Moreover, when we study the histories of the dead and moribund civilizations in detail and compare them with one another, we find indications of what looks like a recurring pattern in the process of their breakdowns, declines, and falls. We are naturally asking ourselves today whether this particular chapter of history is bound to repeat itself in our case. Is that pattern of decline and fall in store for us in our turn, as a doom from which no civilization can hope to escape? In the writer's opinion, the answer to this question is emphatically in the negative. The efforts to create a new manifestation of life, be it a new species of mollusk or a new species of human society, seldom or never succeeds at the first attempt. Creation is not so easy an enterprise as that. It wins its ultimate successes through a process of trial and error, and accordingly the failure of previous experiments, so far from dooming subsequent experiments to fail in their turn in the same way, actually offers them the opportunity of achieving success through the wisdom that can be gained from suffering. Of course, a series of previous failures does not guarantee success to the next comer, any more than it condemns him to be a failure in his turn. There is nothing to prevent our Western civilization from following historical precedent, if it chooses, by committing social suicide. But we are not doomed to make history repeat itself. It is open to us, through our own efforts, to give history, in our case, some new and unprecedented turn. As human beings, we are endowed with this freedom of choice, and we cannot shuffle off our responsibility upon the shoulders of God or nature. We must shoulder it ourselves. It is up to us. What shall we do to be saved? In politics, establish a constitutional cooperative system of world government. In economics, find working compromises varying according to the practical requirements of different places and times between free enterprise and socialism. In the life of the spirit, put the secular superstructure back onto religious foundations. Efforts are being made in our Western world today to find our way towards each of these goals. If we had arrived at all three of them, we might fairly feel that we had won our present battle for our civilization's survival. But these are, all of them, ambitious undertakings, and it will call for the hardest work and the highest courage to make any progress at all towards carrying any one of them through to achievement. Of the three tasks, the religious one is, of course, in the long run by far the most important, but the other two are the more urgent, because if we were to fail in these in the short run, we might lose forever our opportunity of achieving a spiritual rebirth, which cannot just be whistled for at our convenience, but will only come, if it comes at all, at the unhurrying pace at which the deepest tides of spiritual creation flow. The political task is the most urgent of all. The immediate problem here is a negative one. Faced as we are with the prospect, given our present interdependent and present weapons, the world is now on the eve of being unified politically by one means or another. We have to stave off the disastrous denouement of unification by force of arms, the familiar method of the forcible imposition of a pax romana, which is probably the line of least resistance for the resolution of the formidable political forces in whose grip our own world finds itself today. Can the United States and the other Western countries manage to cooperate with the Soviet Union through the United Nations? If the United Nations organization could grow into an effective system of world government, that would be much the best solution of our political crux. But we have to reckon with the possibility of this enterprise's failing, and to be ready, should it fail, with an alternative to fall back upon. Could the United Nations split de facto into two groups, without a breach of the peace? And supposing that the whole face of the planet could be partitioned peacefully into an American and a Russian sphere, could two worlds on one planet live side by side on a footing of non-violent non-cooperation for long enough to give a chance for a gradual mitigation of the present differences in their social and ideological climates? The answer to this question would depend on whether, on these terms, we could buy the time needed to carry out our economic task of finding a middle way between free enterprise and socialism. These riddles may be hard to read, but they do tell us plainly what we most need to know. They tell us that our future largely depends upon ourselves. We are not just at the mercy of an inexorable fate.